There's a moment that happens in archives. It happens quietly, usually alone, late in the day when the reading room has emptied and the only sound is the turn of brittle pages. It is the moment when you find your family's name in a document, and then you find that the place they came from no longer exists. Not destroyed, not conquered. Simply absent. The village is there in the 1850 census. The region appears on the 1780 map, but search for it now and the database returns nothing. The coordinates lead to a place with a different name in a country that didn't exist when your ancestors lived there. The thread between you and them has been cut somewhere in the filing cabinets of history. I have spent years in those cabinets. I have learned to read the silences between documents, the gaps where records should be but aren't, the moments when a word appears on one page and vanishes from the next. Some disappearances leave traces. This is a story about one of those disappearances. Look at a map of Central Asia from 1750. You will find a word written across a vast stretch of territory. The word is Tartary. It appears in large letters spanning thousands of miles, covering lands that now belong to Russia, Mongolia, Kazakhstan, China. On some maps it is labeled Great Tartary. On others, Independent Tartary. On others still, Chinese Tartary. By 1885, the word is gone. No treaty abolished it, no war erased it, no declaration announced its end. One generation of cartographers wrote Tartary across their maps, the next wrote something else. Somewhere in that transition, millions of people were separated from the name that once described where they came from. This is not a story about what Tartary was. We may never know that with certainty. This is a story about what happened to the word itself and to the people who lived under it before it disappeared. It is a story told in paperwork. To understand what was lost, we must first understand what we think we know. Maps change. This is normal. Early cartographers worked with incomplete information, second-hand reports, accounts of travelers who may or may not have been reliable. They labeled vast regions with broad terms because they did not know enough to be specific. As exploration advanced, as empires expanded, the vague gave way to the precise. Old names faded, new names took their place. This is the conventional story. It is not wrong. European mapmakers began using Tartary in the medieval period. They applied it loosely to lands beyond their direct knowledge depths, deserts, mountain ranges stretching from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific. The name derived from the Tatars, one of many peoples who lived in these regions. Though European writers often conflated Tatars with Mongols, Turks, and dozens of other distinct groups, Tartary was less a place than a category. The lands of the unfamiliar, territories beyond the frontier. For centuries, this label served its purpose. Maps from the 1600s show Tartary. Maps from the 1700s show Tartary. The term appears in encyclopedias, travel accounts, diplomatic correspondence. It covered territory now belonging to at least 6 modern nations, one of the largest labeled regions on any world map. And it was, by definition, an outsider's term. The people who lived in these lands did not call themselves Tartars, or some did. They were only one group among many. The word described how Europeans saw this region, not how the region saw itself. This distinction matters. It makes the disappearance of the word seem natural. Of course, an imprecise term would be replaced by precise ones. Of course, Tartary would give way to Turkestan, Mongolia, Manchuria. Knowledge replacing ignorance. The Library of Congress holds map collections spanning this entire period. So do archives in Moscow, Beijing, the national libraries of a dozen countries. The documents exist. The sequence is recorded. You can trace, map by map, the slow refinement of geographic knowledge. But something doesn't quite fit. Different mapmakers placed Tartary in different locations. Some showed it overlapping with the Chinese Empire. Others showed it entirely separate. Some labeled Great Tartary in one region and Independent Tartary in another, as though these were distinct political entities. Though no one today can say with certainty what political structures those labels described. And then there is the timing. The word does not fade gradually, the way you would expect if it were being replaced by better information. It disappears in a window of about 30 years. The same generation that mapped it in detail stopped mapping it at all. Perhaps this is normal. Perhaps this is how cartographic transitions always work. But the timing corresponds to something else entirely. In the 1860s, the Russian Empire began a systematic military campaign to conquer Central Asia. The Khanates of Kokand, Bukhara, and Khiva, independent or semi-independent states that had existed for centuries, were absorbed one by one. By the 1880s, the process was complete. The territories that European maps had labeled Tartary for 200 years were now administered by Russian governors, organized into Russian provinces, recorded in Russian archives. Somewhere in this process, the word disappeared. I have looked for the document that abolished it. The decree, the order, the official announcement that Tartary no longer existed as a cartographic designation. It is not there. There is no single moment, no signature, no date. The Library of Congress holds maps from 1870 that still show Tartary. It holds maps from 1885, where the word has been replaced by Turkestan, Mongolia, various imperial labels. The substitution is complete. The transition is undocumented. A word that had appeared on European maps for 2 centuries, a word that named one of the largest regions on any world atlas, vanished without formal announcement. Cartographers simply stopped writing it. Encyclopedists stopped indexing it. The name that had described a vast territory was replaced by names that described ownership: Russian Turkestan, Chinese Turkestan, imperial territories with boundaries and governors and tax collectors. The old maps still existed. They still exist today. You can find them in archives, rare book collections, digital catalogs of national libraries. Tartary was not burned or hidden. It was made obsolete, superseded, filed under historical terminology, and left to gather dust, while the new names became the only names anyone used. Here's what strikes me. After years of tracing this sequence, the disappearance does not correlate with improved geographic knowledge. It correlates with political conquest. Maps from the 1860s, the decade of Russian expansion, are not significantly more detailed than maps from the 1840s. The topography is similar. Major cities remain in the same locations. What changed was not what cartographers knew, but what they were willing to call the region. Before conquest, Tartary. After conquest, Turkestan. The land did not change, the name did. This is not a conspiracy. It is something more ordinary and more troubling. It is bureaucracy. When an empire absorbs a territory, it renames the territory. It imposes its own administrative categories, its own provincial boundaries, its own terminology. Old names become inconvenient. They suggest autonomy, independence, a prior existence the empire would prefer to forget. The paperwork changes. Maps follow the paperwork. Within a generation, the old name sounds archaic, then obsolete, then forgotten. The people who lived in those lands did not vanish. Their villages did not disappear, but the word that had connected them, however imperfectly, however externally, to a shared geographic identity, was replaced by words that connected them to empires. They became subjects of Russia or China, citizens of provinces created by conquerors, categories and censuses designed to administer rather than describe. Somewhere in the archives there are documents recording this transition. Orders establishing new provincial boundaries, decrees appointing new governors, forms requiring new names. But there is no document that says, as of this date, the word Tartary shall no longer be used. It simply stopped. What happened to Tartary happened to other names too. In 1921, the city of Vernia, name that had appeared on Central Asian maps for decades, was renamed Alma-Ata. In 1936, Kazan became Leninabad. After the revolution, Tsaritsyn became Stalingrad. After de-Stalinization, Stalingrad became Volgograd. Each renaming was documented. Each was deliberate. Each was part of a program to reshape how people understood where they lived. The Bolshevik regime was explicit about this. They called it the rupture of continuity. They wanted to sever the connection between the new Soviet state and the Tsarist past, between the revolutionary present and the imperial history that preceded it. They understood that names were instruments of that severance. A city named after a saint suggested religious continuity. A city named after Stalin suggested revolutionary loyalty. The name determined the meaning. This was not secret, it was policy. Consider what happens when a city is renamed. Old maps become outdated. Old addresses become invalid. Old documents, birth certificates, property records, family histories, suddenly reference a place that no longer officially exists. If your grandmother was born in Verny, her birthplace is now Alma-Ata. If your grandfather came from Tsaritsyn, you must search for him in Volgograd. The thread between generations passes through a knot where names do not match. It was not only cities. The Soviet state also reclassified peoples. The Russian Empire had used broad ethnic categories in its censuses. Tatars might include dozens of distinct groups. Turkic, Mongolic, others united only by the label administrators assigned them. The Soviet state replaced these broad categories with specific nationalities: Kazakh, Uzbek, Tajik, Kyrgyz. Each nationality was given a territory, a language, a literary tradition. Each was supposed to develop along its own path towards socialist modernity. Each was separated by bureaucratic fiat from umbrella terms that had once connected it to neighboring peoples. This was nationality policy, considered progressive at the time recognition of distinct identities, an alternative to crude ethnic generalizations. But it had an effect that may not have been intended. It fragmented. A family that had been Tartar in one census became Kazakh in the next. The word that had connected them to communities across a vast region was replaced by a word that connected them to a single Soviet republic. The old terminology was not forbidden, it simply stopped appearing in official documents, and official documents determined what was real. The word Tartary disappeared from maps in the late 1800s, replaced by imperial and national labels. The word Tartar was fragmented in Soviet censuses, replaced by specific ethnic nationalities. Broad categories that had once connected peoples across inner Eurasia were replaced by narrow categories that sorted them into administrative units. The mechanism was the same each time: paperwork, forms, categories on documents. The slow accumulation of official usage until old words seemed antique. This is not how we usually imagine suppression. We imagine burned books, forbidden names, punishments for wrong terminology. But the most effective suppression is quieter. It works by standardization, making one set of terms official and letting the other become unofficial, not banned, just unused, not destroyed, just deprecated. Old words remain in archives. They are simply no longer the words anyone uses in new documents. After a generation, maybe two, old words become curiosities, footnotes, entries in historical dictionaries no one reads. The connection is severed not by violence, but by disuse. Tartary is what gets erased when bureaucracies standardize. The name that did not survive the transition to modern cartography, modern ethnography, modern statehood. Not because it was actively suppressed. Because it was passively replaced. The paperwork moved on. The word did not. The maps do not agree with each other. This becomes apparent only when you compare them. A French map from 1720 places Tartary in one configuration. A British map from 1750 places it differently. Some show Tartary overlapping with the Chinese Empire. Others show a clear boundary. Some label independent Tartary as a distinct region in Central Asia. Others use the term loosely, a general description of the steppes. This inconsistency has been cited as evidence that European mapmakers were simply guessing, that they did not really know what they were mapping. And disagreements reflect ignorance rather than reality. Perhaps. But the inconsistencies might indicate something else. That Tartary meant different things to different observers at different times. That it was not a fixed territory but a relationship, a category, something that shifted depending on who was drawing the map and what they needed it to show. We cannot resolve this now. The cartographers who made these decisions are long dead, and they did not always explain their reasoning. But the pattern is there in the documents for anyone who compares them. On some late maps, those made just before Russian conquest, the label Independent Tartary appears in Central Asia. It occupies the space that would soon become Russian Turkestan, and then it is gone. The word independent vanishes with the territory. Whatever it had meant, political autonomy, absence of foreign control, something else stopped being recorded at the exact moment the region ceased to be independent. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, world's fairs were held in cities across Europe and North America. These fairs featured elaborate architectural pavilions, many built in styles that evoked historical grandeur: domes, arches, ornamental facades. They were designed to impress. Photographs from these events show buildings of remarkable complexity. Most were demolished after the fairs ended. This was planned from the beginning. Construction records show it. Demolition schedules show it. Temporalization schedules show it. Temporary structures built for display, removed when display was over. The absence of these buildings has been cited, in some corners, as evidence of erasure, as though demolition proves something was being hidden. The records tell a simpler story. But records are not always consulted. Photographs circulate without context. The gap between what was documented and what is imagined grows wider. I mention this to note the pattern. When something disappears, a word from maps, a building from a cityscape absence creates space for interpretation. Records exist. Documents are there. But documents require effort to find, effort to read, effort to understand in context. Absence is immediate. Presence requires research. After the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, some name changes were reversed. Leninabad became Kujand again. Alma-Ata became Almaty. Soviet-era designations were peeled back, and older names, though not the oldest, returned. But pre-imperial terminology did not return. No city was renamed to something that might have been used before Russian or Soviet administration. Words that might have connected contemporary places to regions labeled Tartary on old maps remained archived, unused. The reversal stopped at the Tsarist layer. Anything beneath that was too distant to recover. Or perhaps there was nothing to recover. Perhaps old names were only European labels applied from outside, meaning nothing to the people who actually lived there. We do not know. That is the point. We do not know because documentation is fragmented, archives are dispersed, the transition was recorded in 1,000 bureaucratic decisions but never explained in a single narrative document. The paperwork tells us what happened. It does not tell us what was lost. Let me describe what paperwork did to families. In the Russian Empire, census takers used broad ethnic categories. A family might be recorded as Tartar term. Europeans applied loosely to many different peoples. The family might have spoken a Turkic language, or a Mongolic language, or something else entirely. They might have lived in steppes or mountains or oases. On the form, they were Tartar. That category connected them, on paper, to other families across the empire classified the same way. When the Soviet state reorganized ethnic categories, that family was reclassified. They became Kazakh, or Uzbek, or Tatar. Note the spelling change, single R replacing double R, a small shift marking the difference between old imperial category and new Soviet nationality. They were assigned to a republic, given a national literature expected to develop along a socialist path, no longer connected, on paper, to families who had once shared their classification but were now assigned to different nationalities. This was administrative, not violent. No one was killed for being reclassified. But the effect was real. Families grouped together were now grouped separately. Terminology connecting them across a vast region was replaced by terminology connecting them to a single state. Old paperwork became obsolete. New paperwork became the only paperwork that mattered. Over time, old categories faded. Reference works reclassified Tartary from geographic term to obsolete exonym, word used by outsiders for a region they did not understand. Academic atlases stopped indexing it. Search for Tartary in a contemporary historical atlas, and you will likely find nothing. Not because the word is forbidden, because it has been dispersed into other categories. Material is there, scattered under Central Asia, Inner Eurasia, Turkestan, various national and ethnic headings. But the thread that once connected it has been cut. The Bolshevik regime was explicit about its intent. It aimed to rupture continuity with the Tsarist and pre-imperial past. It succeeded. Names connecting the Soviet present to what came before were replaced by names connecting citizens to the revolutionary project. This was not accident, it was policy. Documented, the point. The mechanism was paper. Forms requiring new nationality designations. Maps using new regional names. Encyclopedias indexing new categories and omitting old ones. Old documents still existed in archives, family collections, basements of government buildings. But they were no longer current. They no longer matched terminology officials used. School children learned. Newspapers printed. Old words became relics. Relics are easy to forget. The danger of paperwork is that it feels neutral. A form is just a form. A category is just a category. But forms determine what can be recorded. Categories determine what can be counted. Over time, forms and categories that survive become the only reality easily accessed. Everything else requires excavation. Search for your family's origins today and you will use databases organized around modern categories. Search by country, ethnicity, administrative region. Search bars accept certain terms and return results. Other terms return nothing. Archives are not destroyed. They are simply not indexed under names that might connect you to them. That is the danger, not destruction. Disconnection. The thread is cut not by fire but by filing. Let me say plainly what the documents show. The word Tartary appeared on Western maps for centuries. It covered vast regions of inner Eurasia territories now belonging to Russia, Mongolia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, parts of China. The word was an exonym, a label applied by outsiders, not a name used by peoples who lived there. It disappeared from maps in the late 19th century during Russian imperial expansion and subsequent Soviet consolidation. No single decree abolished it. The word was replaced through cartographic and administrative standardization, a process documented, deliberate, part of larger programs of state building. Peoples who lived in these regions were reclassified into new ethnic and national categories. Umbrella terms that once connected them were fragmented into designations, assigning them to specific republics, specific nationalities, specific administrative units. This is not speculation. It is what records show. But records do not show everything. They do not show what Tartary meant to people who lived there, if it meant anything, since the term was not their own. They do not show whether any consistent political or cultural identity was erased along with the word, or whether only a foreign label was discarded. They do not show what might be found in archives not fully cataloged, using terminology scholars no longer search for, sitting in basements waiting for researchers who may never come. What remains unresolved is not the mechanism. The mechanism is clear. What remains unresolved is the scope of the loss. This matters now because paperwork still separates families from their history. Names still change when power changes. The process that erased Tartary from maps is not historical, it is ongoing. Every map is an argument about what exists and what does not. Every census is a decision about who belongs where. Every database determines what can be searched and what cannot. If you cannot find your grandfather's village on a map, you might conclude he invented it. You might think family stories are exaggerations, confusions, lies. You might believe you came from nowhere because records say nothing about the somewhere your family described. Paperwork has the final word, and paperwork can be changed. It has been changed many times by many powers for many reasons. Maps we trust were drawn by people who made decisions about what to include and what to omit. Categories we use were created by bureaucrats whose goals may not have included preserving your family's memory of where they came from. This is not conspiracy, it is administration. How states work. Understanding this allows you to read silences in records, to recognize when absence might be a gap rather than a void, when a missing word might have been replaced rather than imagined. Tartary is gone from our maps. But archives remain, old documents remain. The thread was cut, but the ends are still there, waiting for someone to find them, to wonder what they once connected. There is a map in the Library of Congress from 1750. Across a vast stretch of inner Eurasia, in large letters it says, Great Tartary. There is a map from 1850. The word has shrunk. Independent Tartary. Smaller letters, smaller space. There is a map from 1885. The word is gone. In its place, Turkestan, Mongolia, Manchuria, imperial provinces with defined borders. There is a satellite image from today. Same land, different names, nations we know, borders we accept, terminology we search for. Somewhere in an archive there is a document with your family's name on it. Somewhere in that archive there is a document that changed that name to something else. Somewhere between those two documents a thread was cut. We do not know what was on the other side of that thread. We only know it was cut, and we know who held the scissors.